Hi, Linda.
Hi, Carlos.
So nice to have you here today.
Thank you.
So could you please just tell us a little bit about yourself to get us started? A little bit about your background.
Gosh, it never begins with the person, there's always the family. And I think my adventuresome spirit, and one of the reasons I became an archaeologist, was my family history. My father's ancestors were among the first people to roll into the Oregon Territory. I don't even think it was a territory, on the Oregon Trail wagon trains. So they had a bit of wanderlust. And I was studying political science and literature because I've always loved the books. But I went to the University of the Americas when it was still in Mexico City back in 1968.
Wow, what a time to be in Mexico City. My gosh.
Yeah, the year of the Olympics.
A little chaotic. But the local,
to say the least.
Yeah, okay.
And but it was there that I was first exposed through my art history teacher and the museums there and everything, to archaeology and the history of Mexico and the art. So I started exploring Mexico, fell in love with it and archaeology.
As so many people do.
Yeah. I went back to the United States eventually and changed my major to anthropology, archaeology, and I started to say the rest is history, but it's not.
Right.
But I went on to get a bachelor's and a master's degree in anthropology. And during that time, I came back and I did field work in Mexico. I worked with the famous Ramon Piña-Chan in Etzna.
Out in Etzna in Campeche.
In
That's
Campeche,
right.
yeah.
Wow, what a incredible experience that must have been.
Did my master's thesis on the skeletal remains from Teotihuacan. But just here I am talking a lot. But
that's the entire point.
And I worked at the museum in Mexico City, the Anthropology Museum there in Chapultepec Park. But when I was back in California going to university, I also started working at the Los Angeles County Museum of Natural History. And I was there for many years.
Wow.
So lots of background in that sort of thing.
So tell me a little bit about the research you were involved in Etzna. I mean, Etzna is a pretty marvelous site.
Oh,
in a lot of ways, the second city of the Itza, right? So could you tell us a little bit about that? What year was that in, by the way?
I was just going to say, it was in the early 1970s.
Wow, what a time.
So it wasn't as excavated.
Right.
And I was there with, Piña-Chan. He was one of the main directors, but he wasn't always there. So Kuniaki Oi, who was a Japanese archaeologist, he and I spent time basically clearing the sites and surveying and mapping. We were doing restoration. And I go back now and I see certain arches or walkways or something, and they're so basic. And places I would go and sit on just a dirt mound and have my lunch have now been excavated.
Right.
And that's where the sun god masks are. And things are going, I just sat on that.
Right. Oh, how wonderful.
And it was much more isolated. Now there are big roads and museums.
There's a brand new road into Etzna right now. I was there a couple weeks ago, and a brand new road. Pretty good, actually.
Gosh. Yeah, it was a lot more primitive. And, so my time in archaeology was exciting and wonderful, but over the years it changed. I did marry and have children. I came back with my children in the early 80s to do work, but they weren't giving jobs to North Americans, and especially women. It was just a different time. So, and as I've told you, I feel like I've been here in Merida and in the Yucatan, 3 different phases of my life. A maiden, when I did the field work, a mother, and they treat you very differently when you're surrounded with children, and a crone. After I retired, I came back.
I don't know if I'd call you a crone, but
Crone originally meant like a wise older woman.
that's true. That's true.
It
We could get
didn't
into
have the witch connotations. Yeah.
We'll take the original etymology.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the work in Itzna? I imagine you were, like usually in archaeological digs, using a lot of labor from people around in the community for the actual hard labor, right?
Yes.
Because of course, when archaeologists are working, you're doing the fine work per se, but all the lugging of material and stuff like that. Not that I'm sure you did your fair share of that, right? But how was it working with people from the community?
Hard workers. I've never known such hard workers. We would go to the local communities around Campeche and all, and hire people, even masons, because we were reconstructing walls. But as I said, a lot of the work was clearing and just moving dirt. And I'd get in there. We brought in wheelbarrows because everyone was using baskets with the trunk lines, and they didn't like the wheelbarrows. You know?
I just because this is the way we pick corn, so this is the way we carry rocks, so we just go with what we know.
Exactly. And as I mentioned before, being a woman in the field, some of these people had never seen, before my hair was white, it was red, strawberry blonde, long, and they'd never really seen freckles and long red hair. And sometimes they'd actually come up and touch me to see if I was a woman. There wasn't a role model for a woman scientist.
Right.
I considered myself a scientist. And also, if I gave instructions, I couldn't walk out to our workers, maybe 40 people, and say, okay, this week we want to clear this mound and put all the refuse, the dirt and everything over here. They would just stare at me, even if it was in Spanish or Maya. But if I turned to one of the leaders, managers, jefes, and said the same thing, then they'd all go do it.
Right.
But they wouldn't take orders from a woman. Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
How is your Mayan? You have some basic halacho,
I do have some basic hieroglyphics and basic words because I like the language, but I do not. No, just words.
You're not an epigrapher. That's an entirely different area of study.
No. And as I started, once I retired, writing books about the history, the conquest, the Maya, then I inserted a lot of Mayan words and phrases with in italics.
Yes.
With comma, and then the thing, because I really wanted people to know that the Maya people and the Maya language is very much alive, and
very much,
and to respect their culture and their history.
It really is astonishing to me still in this day and age. I get questions from people, but wait, the Maya disappeared and they're gone, and you're like,
exactly.
No, there's like literally like almost a million in like Mexico alone, right? And there's just this kind of sad myth, a sad racist myth out there, rooted, of course, in, these people could have not possibly built this. It must have been either Atlanteans or Greeks or Egyptians or whatnot.
You're right.
And it's just really flabbergasting, It's like, wow. Okay.
Yeah, or aliens landed and a
lot of times it's not even out of malice but it's just this kind of idea that's permeated our culture since the 19th century, and when all the big discoveries of Stevens and everything started coming to light. So, and
the people that were around the ruins, they themselves didn't have the answers. They said, I don't know who built this. It's always been there, because it had been so many years since the conquest, and even before the conquest, many of the large cities, Uxmal and places like that, were already deserted and overgrown.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think that there's a very clear continuity artistically throughout time, and that's one thing. When I was doing my research for my master thesis out in Santa Elena in the Puc region, that I was really stressed upon me. It's like a lot of the stuff that we see even really great craftsmen and artisans producing today, they're kind of getting secondhand through like illustrations and scientific publications and stuff like that, and recreating it that way. So there's not that direct line, though kind of spiritually, I guess, in a way. Of course, it's their heritage, and they interpret it in the way they're going to interpret it now and work with it how they choose. But that is a very interesting thing. I mean, there's the conquest was so violent and represented such a big break. Yeah. Right. There's not just this kind of one-to-one continuation. I mean, in any civilization, things were very different 1,000 years ago. So it's unfair to expect that.
Well, I dealt with this a lot when I wrote the book Scribe, because in Scribe, I had 3 objectives. One, as I just mentioned, was to let the world know that the Maya, unlike other civilizations that were conquered and disappeared, that the Maya are still very much alive, well, and flourishing here. I think, except for Coca-Cola and the steel machete, if everybody went away, they'd still be living just like they did 1,000 years ago. But
satellite dish.
Yeah. TV. Okay. Yes, I will.
Very, very big. Yeah. Maybe a PlayStation.
But the other was that to give a realistic view of what it's like to be an archaeologist, to the hardships, environmentally, you're in very rough conditions. What it's like to deal with government and bureaucracy and corruption. I
had my own experience with that just yesterday.
And to support the science. There's grant writing and so on.
Yeah, it's not all sexy running through the jungle, right?
It is not Indiana Jones.
or Lara Croft or any of that.
Every temple he ever went into ended up being destroyed. That is not what it's all about. We're into preservation.
But every once in a while, you have to admit, you must have had a bit of that romantic feeling and been able to be transported away. Really, have it remind you why you're passionate about this in the first place.
Because, yes, when you uncover a wall that still has the plaster on it and the paintings, or you find an intact piece of pottery or something, it is
There's
definitely.
No more,
And I think archaeologists have to be of a certain ilk, that you do have an imagination, that you don't just see piles of rocks or rubble, that you can say, visually, this is what it was at one time. And I would stand on the causeways or look out over the Sea of Green from the top of a pyramid and say, this was once a grand city with tens of thousands of people. So, I've always had a vivid imagination. That served me well to keep me going during the hard times.
That's really important to emphasize. I mean, when I'm with people at archaeological sites, that's what I always tell them. And sometimes even when I write articles, Lee will say to me, my editor, oh, well, you've said this before in another article before or whatever. You said again, it was all covered in plaster, stucco, and painted. But that's because that's important, right? Like you have to be aware of this. We're literally looking at a ruin, right? So you have to use your imagination. You have to imagine the incense burning. You have to imagine the city markets. You have to imagine a thriving community, not just, as you put it, a bunch of rocks, which is sadly the way some people with very little imagination do see it. And if you've seen one of them, you've seen all of them, which is like...
I've heard that before.
I don't need to go. I've been to Chichen Itza one time, like 20 years ago, so I'm good. I'm like, okay, weird. Okay. So could you tell us a little bit more about Scribe?
I wrote Scribe because of my love of archaeology. See, after I stopped doing field work here and went back to the United States, I completely shifted gears. The same week I turned 40, I started law school.
Oh.
Okay. So, and people go, archaeology to law? And I would tease and say, well, they're both jungles. But I went to law school and ended up working at the Oregon State Legislature, and then I did practice in trust and estates. This is all for 25 years or so. And then when I got ready to retire, I came home to Merida, to the Yucatan. And over the years, I was always collecting things. I'm very analog in this digital world, but I had paper files and notes. And I said, I'm going to write about my time as an archaeologist. And I wanted it to be historically accurate. And so I was somewhat telling my story, but it evolved into parallel stories where the archaeologist, I mean, nothing about, a woman archaeologist.
Oh, it's not autobiographical at all, is it?
Autobiographical, right. And there's also a Maya scribe. And so as the archaeologist is digging things up, and you can envision, like in a movie, the archaeologist is dusting off the pot,
right,
the pottery, and the camera pulls back, and the Maya scribe is writing the history on the pottery,
right,
because after the Christians came during the conquest, and Bishop DeLanda burned the books and destroyed thousands, tens of thousands.
So frustrating,
icons and art, things. The people had to preserve their traditions, their astronomy, their mathematics, their medicine somehow. And the buildings last and the pottery last. And so that's what I have them doing. So it's two parallel lives that keep crossing.
That's so interesting.
And I love doing that. And so that's what I did. And as I said, I really tried to keep it accurate. One of the other things that I was trying to explain in Scribe is antiquity theft. That's its subtitle, Antiquity Theft in the Maya Ruins. Because people don't realize, but right along with drugs and guns and human trafficking, antiquity theft is a multi-billion-dollar business. Indeed. Around the world. And when looters and grave robbers come in and steal things from the Maya ruins, it's out of context.
Exactly.
And they often destroy everything in doing it. When I worked at the museum and people would walk in with a magnificent piece, I would say, it's beautiful, but useless. It's out of context.
Right. Where's this from? How can we date this with no...
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
So I tried to explain that perhaps we shouldn't be, buying these things. And that led me into another book that I wrote called Arte Maya, this one.
Yeah.
With the
artifact. So this is Scribe, by the way, here.
Oh, and on the cover of Scribe, I couldn't find the picture that I wanted, so I drew my own. I'm not the artist. But I put all these hieroglyphs, and each one has a meaning, like the storyteller or stone house, or this is the symbol for books, and so on. So cool. So kind of like secret messages.
Right.
But when I was doing research for Scribe, I of course wanted the scribe when she was, whoops, I gave away a secret there. When the scribe was making the pottery in secret.
No spoilers.
No spoilers. I wanted to say, well, how did she make it? What were her materials? What were her techniques? Not the way they do it today with the big modern kilns and glazes and things, because they didn't have those. But I started researching to make it accurate how it was done, and I went to these people who are Maya who do it in Tikul. Tikul is a town famous not only for its shoes but for its pottery. But these folks, Luis and Lourdes, have been making reproductions. Museum quality
They're
reproductions.
Fantastic.
I mean, their things are in the Rockefeller collection and Metropolitan Museum in New York and all over the world, just collectible. They have to sign them, because if they don't, people will sell them as the real thing. It's
or at the
accurate.
airport, sometimes there've been some run-ins like, oh, you're smuggling artifacts. Like, no, it's a reproduction, I promise.
Right. So I was saying, would you teach me how to do this? And they're going, well, do you want to spend 3 months with us? So I ended up you were talking about the workers before. I ended up digging clay and mixing it and collecting the real and making everything by hand, sanding it with sericota leaves from a tree, not sandpaper, and painting with paints that were made from rocks, and everything was natural pigments. But I learned it step by step. So 3 months later, and as I was learning from them, I realized that, well, their children weren't going to do it. There were only a handful of people who were old, like me, who could carry this on. So I did what is like salvage archaeology. I recorded in a book, step by step, everything that I learned. They allowed me to, how it's done, what the materials are, what all the secrets are. And I did, these are actually pieces I made. So.
Wow, those are.
Yeah.
And, and as you were talking about, because it all connects again with Scribe as well, because one project leads to another.
It does.
And you were mentioning, how, in the book, your character is painting pottery and working with it and everything. And here you are doing the same thing, not just in literature, but in real life, right?
Sure.
And that, in a way, is very transformative. And a lot of times these kind of very like primal basic things that we do as human beings, like, like to eat things over fire or make pots or be outside. Really kind of like connect us to the mind frame and to the mindset of people in antiquity and other times.
Yeah.
And we can really kind of place ourselves there in a way that's not possible otherwise.
And everything leads to something else, the whole web of life. In doing so, I wanted to learn more about the daily life, as you said. And so I went to a small village called Ekbalam, near the
archaeological site, yes, of course.
Site. And I learned about, and you're going to be doing some more writing about this. I learned about the corn and grinding on the 500-year-old metate, making your own tortillas.
Through nixtamalization and
roasting the cacao beans for the chocolate and grinding that and making the chocolate patties. Harvesting the Melipona bee honey, the stingless bees, and how to weave a hammock. And I just love doing it. And people were saying, "Oh, that's so cool." And I'm saying, "Come with me." So I brought a small group of people, and we live in the village, total immersion for a week. It is not your typical tour.
No, I mean, hardly.
No, hardly. I mean, you're going to wake up to the roosters and the dogs, but
people love
see
that.
how people live, and how a simple minimalist life can be so joyful. It's not what material things you have in life, but and people walk away with a new appreciation. They walk away with a new respect. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
So I do my immersion weeks.
When do you think you're going to be able to get started again with that again?
I would have said.
Do you have any idea?
Perhaps in the fall.
Perhaps in the fall?
Yeah, well, I would love to. I still have people writing to me saying, when?
I'm sure you do.
Yeah.
I'm sure you do. Yeah, so other than this fantastic little book, what else have you written about recently regarding your immersion program, these activities you run?
Well, I haven't written a book about the immersion. It's still an experience type of a thing. I may in the future, but when I was working on Scribe, I had questions, and they always say, write what you want to read, but I had a lot of questions when I wrote sections about Bishop DeLanda burning books and things. I was going, how did this Franciscan who loved people, learn the Maya language, came here to build a utopian society, what changed him psychologically into an inquisitor and a destroyer of the culture and all their artifacts? I didn't quite, so I thought, I think I'll write a book about Bishop DeLanda. I actually traveled to Spain, and I went to the Archive of the Indies in Seville, it took some doing, but I got certified, and I could go in and hold documents he had written in my hands, with the red wax seal and everything.
Oh, boy.
But as I started researching him more and more, fascinating story, I also ran across, and this is what happens to writers, you get sidetracked, but I found out that he had an interpreter that worked with him who had been trained by the Franciscans as a young man, whose name was, his Christian name was Gaspar, but he was a member of the Shu family who allied with the Spaniards, the Montejos, when they first came to the Yucatan on their third try of conquest of the peninsula. But their tribe, their clan, allied with the Spanish to help them conquer and subdue. I shouldn't say totally conquer. So his family, but he was trained as a young noble's son to learn the language and be converted. But he was so good at languages, he not only spoke Mayan, he learned Spanish, Latin. He ended up being a Latin teacher, Nahuatl, the Aztec language. But I was fascinated, and this was a real person. Yeah. And he had been, ended up being Yolanda's interpreter. He worked for the crown as a royal translator interpreter. He worked at the Indian court. There's an old legend that says at any one time in the world, there are 36 righteous persons and they aren't necessarily saints or great leaders or generals, but these righteous persons who are doing good, usually very subtly, who save the rest of us from destruction.
Yeah.
And my question was he one of these righteous people? He was called a traitor by his own people because he worked with the Spanish, but the Spanish never considered him one of them. And yet, for example, when the king sent 50 questions to everyone he had granted a land grant to here in the Yucatan, he sent out 50 questions, said, you will answer these and send it back to the crown, or you'll lose your land grant. Well, most of the people were soldiers. They were better with swords than they were with pens. So they called on Gaspar, and they said, help us, because the questions were, what was it like before, during, and after the conquest? So he helped write and answer all their questions. You see repeats in the various answers that went back. And some of them were so pleased they knew that it was his work, not theirs, that he actually signs at the bottom of what they submitted to the crown. So I have copies of his signatures. Wow. And but he was an outstanding, this is in the 1500s. He lived to be about 80 years old. Wow. But I loved his story, and I really had to dig to find out what he wrote, where he lived, even going through cathedral records of his granddaughter's marriage, to a Spaniard, and the prejudice that came between the intermarriages. So I was dealing with a lot of discrimination issues and conquest issues.
Yes, it's a fascinating topic, and just for people watching that may not know, the Shu were, of course, the dynasty, the lineage in Uxmal, right?
Yes,
and originally. One of the really interesting things about them is that we have an uninterrupted line of Shus. Yeah. And during the 1970s, when the Queen of England came, of course, I'm sure you know this story, but maybe some people don't. It was only the Shu patriarch was able to directly address the queen front on personally, because he was of blue blood, right? He was still considered of a royal lineage. So there were the president and the governor sitting around waiting for the queen to approach and greet them, while he and only he was granted the privilege of directly approaching her. So that's kind of beautiful, right? It's very interesting, and
I like that.
It's really need to bring a dignity, to.
I love that story. Yeah.
Yeah, it's.
And the June 1947, there's a Life magazine picture of one of the descendants of Gaspar Shoe, and it has like a stele carving, and then he's in front, and it's the same profile, like he had stepped out of history.
There's also this really great photo of Pakal, of course, of Palenque, and this guy just like in profile with him, and it's like carbon copy.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah,
I know. Yeah,
that's very fascinating.
And but I really enjoyed writing about Gaspar, the noble witness, to the conquest, and how it's different than the chronicles that the Spanish wrote, because he's viewing it through the Maya. And I go before, during, and after the conquest, because a lot of the history was of drought and famine, and a lot of disease had wiped out.
And he, of course, had to also be pragmatic. It's very easy through the lens of history to be like, oh, a traitor or whatever. But, you have to do what you have to do, to keep yourself alive, and also the people who are around you.
Yeah.
So, Linda, where can people get a hold of your books?
All of my books, these, and I'd written others before. Actually, from my Trust and Estates days, I wrote a book called Widow's Key that's about, grief and death and dying. I hate to say that. And that won a National Book Award. But this is more my going toward history and this area. They're all on Amazon. Amazon.com.
Except for this,
yes,
right?
Yes, that is, I just have that printed, and that's available locally at the Merida English Library.
Mel, very good.
And Between the Lines, or from me.
Between the Lines is a shop
yes,
a great bookstore here in Merida, by the way. I really encourage everybody to check out these fantastic books. Linda, it's been such a honor and a privilege to have you be our first guest.
Okay.
And thank you so much. And hopefully we'll have you on again sometime.
Yeah.
And we'll continue the conversation.
On my next book. Yeah.
Absolutely. If not before. Thank you so much, Linda.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Best wishes.